President Nixon not only wanted his library to be a place of historical inquiry, but also a place where ideas can be discussed, especially by young people about the future of our country. It's the youth, President Nixon says, that gives a country its new infusion of spirit. So I'd like to introduce our event partners this evening, Robert and Megan Zwerling of US Vigilance, who we couldn't have produced this event without. Robert is a tech executive in Orange County, and Megan is a senior at the other USC, the University of South Carolina, where she majors in biomedical engineering. Their organization, US Vigilance, is dedicated to fidelity to the United States Constitution and the Republican form of government, and to this end, their mission is to encourage fact-based, reasoned debate on public policy and the development of responsible citizenship. They're also the authors of a great book called Vigilance, The Price of Liberty, What You Can Do to Save America Tomorrow, which is available in our museum store, and they'll be happy to meet every one of you and sign a copy of it as well. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Robert and Megan Zwerling. Thank you.
I'd like to point out before we begin that it's the real USC. Just saying.
Good evening. I can see that none of us are Cubs fans since we're here tonight. Figure that after 108 years? Maybe. We'll see. Thank you, Jonathan. For those of you who haven't been here at the Nixon Library, and those of you who have and have seen the original exhibit, I really encourage you to see this new exhibit. It is outstanding, and it puts into perspective really the Nixon as the man and Nixon as the figure in history. So do take your time and do go see it. And we stand here at a precipice where we had such serious discussions in presidential campaigns. We had such serious men talk about things. And we fast forward to today, and we have a different kind of campaign. We're talking about different kinds of issues. And I don't know that it's gotten any better. I think we may have taken a few steps back. And some have said that, I think reasonably so, that this is not only a different election and a difficult election, but maybe one that isn't the most tasteful. And one man derided the Republican nominee by having a parody to what Yoda might say to Luke Skywalker. And he says, "Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to the Republican nomination." Or another man disgusted with the Democratic choice said, "Trump makes me nervous, but Hillary makes me want to take poison." Still another man lamented. He said, "This election is more like having a gun in both hands pointed at my head and deciding which trigger to pull." And this is in concert with what surveys are telling us. If we look at the surveys on the disapproval ratings, we're looking at candidates with over a 55% disapproval rating. It's never happened in the history of these surveys. The highest disapproval rating was with Barry Goldwater, and it was 47%. And 59% of the people say that they are voting against a candidate, where only 39% say they're voting for a candidate. So how did we get here? That's not for me to answer. I'm going to turn it over to Megan and let her introduce our guests.
Thank you. So this is where US Vigilance comes in. And in working with the Nixon Foundation for a second time, we've brought together 5 college students yet again to discuss the issues of substance that are facing our generation. And frankly, it's the generation that all of us are dependent upon to make the necessary changes. So for our last panel discussion in the spring, we discussed political correctness on college campuses. And we as US Vigilance continue to support the idea of the importance of starting the conversation. So not being afraid to disagree. In fact, if anything, we should celebrate it. And that's why we're here tonight. Discuss, disagree, and let's have a resolution. So without further ado, because I know all y'all did not come here to hear us speak, I'd like to get this conversation started by introducing our wonderful moderator, who, I need to get this right, this man has been on public radio in Southern California longer than anyone, continuously, and is currently the host of KPCC's All Things Considered, as well as an instructor of journalism at Cal State Long Beach. Nick Roman.
Thank you for that applause. I don't ever hear that in the studio, so it's kind of a nice thing to have. I am the only staffer on KPCC who actually lives in Orange County, so I think that's how come I got this assignment. We are KPCC, that is the most listened to public radio station in the country, but I'm also proud that we are the most listened to public radio station in Orange County, and that makes a big deal. That's a big deal for me. I went to UC Irvine. Actually grew up in the Pasadena area, not very far from where our studios are today. And some of you may think that the call letters are KPPC, which was a rock and roll station in LA back in the 60s, which I remember well, and my high school friends think I work at right now. And I never try and disabuse them of that idea. That, oh yeah, man, I'm playing some cool stuff on the radio. The show that I host, All Things Considered, is from National Public Radio, from NPR, and I've been doing that for about 3 years. Before that, I'd been an editor at KPCC, and we've grown by leaps and bounds. The staff is 4 times as big as it was when I arrived there in '04, and in fact, one of our members of the Board of Trustees, Jarl Mohn, is now the president of NPR, and he comes around town every now and then talking about the things that we're going to try, that NPR is going to try and do. So we are proud of being an NPR station. We are proud of being a station that tries to appeal to the entire political spectrum. And if you've ever listened to Larry Mantle's show, Air Talk, that is an outstanding show, and I'd encourage all of you to listen to it for somebody who knows what he's doing and is an even-handed and actually the nicest guy on the staff, too. That's some aspiration. One of the political lessons that I've learned in all the time that I've been doing public radio goes actually way back to when President Nixon was in office, and he signed the constitutional amendment and then began the ratification process on the 26th Amendment, which gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. The first election, when that was available, was 1972, and I missed it by a month, 1 month. But still, I was happy that 18-year-olds, those little punks, could get to vote before I could. Nonetheless, the lesson learned there is that I had to wait a couple more years, so I had to be patient to cast a ballot. And the 26th Amendment is a good example of patience. It was actually first introduced in the 1940s when President Roosevelt dropped the draft age from 21 down to 18. And a lot of people felt during World War II that if you were old enough to fight for your country, you should be old enough to vote. And so West Virginia Congressman by the name of Jennings Randolph introduced that constitutional amendment in the 1940s, and it didn't pass. And he introduced it again and again and again through the 50s, through the 60s. He even had President Eisenhower's support. Didn't pass. He introduced that 11 times before it passed. 30 years went by. There had been an effort to to include a line in the Voting Rights Act that would allow 18-year-olds to vote. And President Nixon actually signed that bill, but said at the time, I don't think this is going to pass muster. Somebody's going to sue and it won't go. There has to be a constitutional amendment. And eventually, when that case went through the US Supreme Court, the amendment came down. The Congress passed it. Immediately when the president signed it, that day 6 states ratified it. Within a month, it had been ratified by enough states so that 18-year-olds could vote, and that was 1971. All it took was 30 years for a good idea. For those of you who are wondering, the right for women to vote took 40 years from the time the first constitutional amendment was introduced to the time that it was actually passed and then ratified. So I learned early on, my little 2 years of waiting to actually vote, that's just patience. And you learn how to be patient with politics. I went to Catholic school and was taught by nuns, and I learned patience there too. Catholic Church is filled with that, as it is today. But these young guys are anxious and eager and want to get stuff done. They are like I was 40 years ago, and I want you to hear them and give them a chance to share their ideas and their thoughts. And I will try and play traffic cop for about an hour, and we'll have some questions at the end. So let me introduce them to you. These are snappy guys. I just spent about an hour with them, so I know what I'm talking about. Our first guest is from Chapman University, just down the freeway a little bit, Max Sharp. Second up, next to Max, is Miles Robinson. He's from Pomona College. In the number 3 position from the University of Southern California, the real USC, is Luke Phillips. And next to Luke, from Claremont McKenna College, which is a beautiful place, David Brown. And rounding out our trio of Claremont colleges, from Pitzer College, is Elliot Dordick. So before we came out, we had a nice long discussion here, and the general idea here is to talk to them about their views of what sort of future the candidates in this election will leave for them. I don't have to worry so much about that, but they do. They've got a lot more time ahead of them, and so we'll start just by asking a basic question about the millennial voice. We had talked about that a little bit backstage before we came out. So let me start with, well, let's just go down the line. We'll start with Max. Max, tell me about millennial voice. What do you see the millennial voice, what do they see in the candidates, and what do you want the candidates to say to them?
Well, I think you have two different sides of the millennial voice. You have the conservative and the liberal, but both of them have something in common. They both want to fight against the establishment. The liberals want to fight against establishment and put people in that will do the job correctly and not be so corrupt or so inefficient. And the Republican, the conservative side, they want to fight against Republican establishment because they don't think that they've done enough to limit government and to stop the corruption at its source, which is government power.
Miles?
Hello? Oh. In my opinion, the millennial voice is something very interesting, and although in this time, especially in this presidential election, it seems that the candidate that espoused the millennial voice most is no longer the election. That was Bernie Sanders, someone that a lot of millennials were very attracted to. And I think a reason for this is that people are very upset. A lot of millennials, people in my age, are very idealistic, and we're dreamers in a sense. We're at an age, especially those that are young around our age, where pragmatism hasn't exactly entirely set in, where we're still focused on our hopes and our dreams. And looking at the way the country currently is, we don't see an environment, or some of us don't see an environment, where we can achieve those hopes and dreams. And so I think the millennial voice of the current moment is one of optimism, but also one of frustration as well.
Elliot?
Okay. I don't think there is one millennial voice. I think we all have our own voices and ideals, and we share them with you plenty on the internet. And the second part of this question, which I think is actually potentially more contentious, is can any of the candidates speak for the millennial voice? So once we agree that we don't have one singular millennial voice, I think we should think about how important it is for a candidate actually to speak for those millennials. And I personally don't think it's the job of a candidate to speak for millennials. It's their job to speak to us, our job to decide if our views and policy ideas are in alignment, and then to cast our vote. I don't think that specifically speaking for millennials is something that I want Hillary Clinton or Trump to do.
Miles? I'm sorry.
There is a millennial voice, and the polling would show that before he was wrongfully kept from the first debate, the millennial voice was in favor of Gary Johnson, who was winning among voters 18 to 24. This is because the millennial voice is socially accepting. The millennial voice wants everyone to be treated as an equal, both by individuals and by the government. But the millennial voice also recognizes that our government is currently unsustainable. We want a smaller government. We want less taxes. We want the right to be able to do what we want. We want the right to be able to be different, both economically and socially. The millennial voice is the libertarian voice, and the millennial voice supports Gary Johnson.
Luke, you get to close this out.
Well, David, I am a millennial, and I am not a libertarian. I think when I look at the millennial temperament, there are a couple trends you can discern. We do tend to be more socially accepting. We do tend to be more individualistic. But that said, millennial Southerners are Southerners who have a few tweaks, but they're still Southerners. Millennial West Coasters are still West Coasters. I think there's a lot more in common between people across generations than between people within generations. And so although you'll see some trends on maybe a few social issues that millennials tend to maybe perhaps agree on, I don't think it's strong enough or united enough that there can be a real millennial voice, a real millennial candidate, or a real millennial movement.
I want to go to Elliot because he had raised this before we got started about that there is no clear millennial voice, and yet the candidates are trying to talk to you. Are they saying anything that grabs you?
I think that there's not one clear millennial voice, but we do our own organizing. There are even youth political organizations like Turning Point USA, which is a young conservative group that has their own voice, but it comes from younger people, and they accept certain things that are told to us in debates, and they take issue with other things. But I think a good premise of the organization is that they don't think it's the job of a candidate to really effectively use Twitter, and that we should evaluate them based on how they do things that millennials also happen to do.
Luke, you're nodding your head there.
You know, as somebody who worked in a millennial nonprofit that was explicitly aimed at building up a quote-unquote millennial political movement, it failed, so maybe I'm disillusioned because of that. But moreover, I just think there's just so much diversity within millennial ranks that, yes, as we start to get into office, there might be some changes in tone of what different legislative bodies start to think. But I don't think you're ever going to have a real millennial movement that transcends ideologies, that transcends regions, and transcends that kind of stuff. If you want to study what millennial politics is, you have to look at the sheer diversity of different opinions among millennials, see what is in common between them, but understand that you're going to have conservative millennial groups, you're going to have liberal millennial groups, and there's not going to be very much in common between them other than their age at the fundamental point. That said, they're still important to listen to. Please listen to me. But it's not going to be, I don't think, a hugely transforming trend in American politics or history anytime soon.
I disagree.
David, go ahead.
I think if we're looking at the actual data, we can say that, sure, we're all individuals together, and we all have our own opinions, but if we look at something like recreational marijuana, for example, where nearly 70% of millennials support it, while the silent generation is in the 20s, right? Like, that's very clearly a millennial voice. There are some things that are bound to happen because the millennials have a voice, and it's certainly not 100%. People are still capable of free thought, nothing's changed, but we have a voice, something like Social Security, right? Millennials are being forced to deal with the fact that we have a program that the government cannot support indefinitely. And it's a millennial voice that we need to either address that and alter it or get rid of it entirely. The environment is a millennial voice because we know that we cannot sustain the environment as it currently is. That is something that we have to think about. The millennials are also having to deal with things like cybersecurity, these new challenges that are popping up. And sure, we don't always agree on how to fix them, but it's just ridiculous to say that we don't have some sort of millennial voice and some sort of millennial opinion on these issues.
I'm going to agree with David here in that I believe as current, right now, we as millennials don't completely understand our own power. We have yet to embrace the role that we have and can have in US politics at the local level, but also at the federal level. We have yet to understand that as a group, although we are diverse in our opinions and what we want and we desire for this country and the way that we want this country to be headed, there are some common things, and I think that we have yet to put these into action. Even though that we are the generation to grow up, or the first generation to grow up with Twitter, Facebook, social media, different ways of learning so that our brains think and learn differently. At the same time, we have yet to use these methods and mediums effectively to get out and to get our voices heard. You'll see, some things of what the current millennial narrative is through media and through the news. You'll hear about what millennials are doing, what they're protesting, what they're actively in favor of. This doesn't encompass all of our voices, but it does give you some idea of what some people are angry about. So I most definitely think that there is a millennial voice. It's not a united one, but there is a loud one, and it does exist, and we have yet to use it effectively for politics.
Luke, and then I want to hear from Max, but go ahead, Luke.
Well, I just want to say, Miles, the qualifier you said there, it is a divided one. It is not a united one. That is exactly what I'm saying. And so yeah, we all do care about climate change, more so than older generations. We all do care about entitlement reform, I think, more than a lot of older generations will. Do we have any kind of semblance of agreement on the broad worldviews and the specific policies that can be used to solve those? Good luck. Good luck finding it. Maybe it's possible, but I'll believe it when I see it.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that it's more. It would be a better idea to look at what policies can fix the problems we have than to figure out how we can cater to certain people. I think that we need to, millennials and especially need to go back to what can you do for your country instead of what can your country do for you. When you have what can your country do for you, we look to what can we do for millennials, what can we do for African Americans, what can we do for women, and when we do that, it separates us apart instead of unifying us.
So if there's no single voice, is there at least a single issue that you're all concerned about?
Just to be clear, we just all gave the same opinion 5 different ways.
Incorrect.
Is there a single issue?
National debt.
National debt.
Foreign policy.
foreign policy?
Climate change.
And there are 3 single issues that millennials all care about right there.
So if there's no single voice, and there are a number of different issues, then what are you looking for from your candidates?
Well, the topic of our conversation is supposed to be which candidate is best for the college graduate, so
Right.
let's look for jobs and economic growth and something that'll help the college graduate. Not that I've graduated, but I think that's what we should probably talk
And
about.
are you hearing that? Are you hearing that from anybody?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I thought you meant from us so far.
No. I'm talking about, are you hearing, are any candidates talking along those lines, on those issues that you care
Yeah,
about?
specifically, I'm a Trump supporter, and when he talks about, even just his tone when he's talking about China and stopping intellectual property theft and taxing imports and bringing production back to the U.S., those millions of jobs right there, just in a few sentences said with a certain tone to make it clear that America doesn't have any reason to let China or anyone else take jobs away from us. So you can pick a million policies if you want to debate the details of them, but I hear hope and aspiration put into the minds of Trump supporters, and it comes a lot from attitude.
Well, Miles, you hear something else.
I was going to go along a more general topic, and that would be compromise. I'm a Hillary Clinton supporter. I voted for her in the primary, and I'll vote for her again in the general election. And the one thing I see in her that I don't see in any other candidate, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, is compromise. On college campuses, the ones, Pomona College where I go to, in the general environment there, internships I've participated in over the summer, I'm astonished and I'm appalled at the way Americans don't seem to be able to have conversations anymore. I remember reading an article in the Washington Post about how politicians in Washington, D.C., across the political divide, would invite each other over for dinner, Republicans and Democrats sitting at the same table, breaking bread, just having general conversations about politics. Millennials, at least in college environments, don't seem to be capable of this, and it's something that we as a nation can't continue to allow. I despise, honestly, the amount of polarization that has gone on that is perpetrated in the media, but also that individuals have. And I think a big reason for this is technology. It becomes so much more easy not to talk to people that we disagree with in today's world. Facebook has algorithms that make it so that we see things that we want to see and we don't see things that we don't want to see. It's too easy to not speak, talk, or think about anyone that doesn't agree with anyone or that doesn't agree with you, and that's what I see in Hillary Clinton. I see someone that's able to reach across the aisles, that has perhaps a stronger and more conservative foreign policy, but that's willing to compromise on that, that's willing to compromise on social and economic issues. And I see progress in compromise.
Max, go ahead.
Well, in terms of compromise, I don't know. It's obviously a good thing when you're talking to people socially, but politically, I think compromise is a problem. I mean, you have politicians that are not principled and who don't care about certain issues. They're going to get swayed by special interests. They're going to become corrupt, and they're not going to stand for the issues that they stood for in the elections.
I don't think it's that quite simple. I mean, some people have called Hillary Clinton two-faced in that she has two personal opinions. For example, if a leader in any case could be against abortion, for instance, but at the same time, politics isn't about what you want as a leader, especially not a democracy just as America. It's about what you think is the good for the country. So you can be against something like abortion or against guns or for more control, but still willing to allow policies that are for those things because it's not up to you. We have a government where not even the President of the United States can lay down the law, just like recently Congress vetoed a proposition that Obama put forth. We have checks and balances. We have compromise. That is what our nation is about. And so I don't think it's quite as simple as a politician they don't have
Principles.
They don't have, thank you. They don't have principles just because they learn from their mistakes and they change their opinions based on certain issues.
Well, that's one thing. I think that's how you develop principles. But what I see from Hillary, and unfortunately I also see it in Trump somewhat, is they both have had histories of supporting different issues, and now they supporting issues now support completely different issues. I want someone who, and that's fine because that's principles. but I want someone who I believe truly believes in a principle and is going to go to Washington, listen to all the different voices, and still persevere with that principle.
I have a question then about perseverance. I mean, at the same time that you want to hold on to your principles and there are things that you want to have done, you also have to succeed in office. And that would lend itself toward compromise. So how do you hold on to your principles and compromise and succeed? I mean, there are a lot of things that you got to do there. And most presidents have been able to, walk that path. Luke, go ahead.
So to be clear, both of these gentlemen are right and both of these gentlemen are wrong. If you focus entirely on the idea of compromise, on the idea of getting stuff done, on the idea of not having principles and just doing what is in the broader public good, then you might get some stuff passed. But there's an organization I used to work for in Washington, D.C. called No Labels that has made that its exact policy platform, and they've presided over maybe 2 laws being passed. On the other hand, if you stand just for your principles and you stand just for what you think and how right you are about the world and how everybody else is wrong for not seeing the world the way you are because your donors and your supporters voted you into office to do that, you're not going to get much done. I mean, I think probably the 2 biggest examples on the far left and the far right of principled politics are Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz, and we can take a look at their legislative records and talk about how great politicians they are. I personally don't think either is particularly skilled in the art of politics. So the way I've always been taught by mentors of mine and by historical figures I look up to is you got to have a couple goals, you have to have a broad understanding of how the world works, but you have to be pragmatic about how to put that into place. And if you have a castle in the sky, a golden vision of a tomorrow we could have, that's going to inspire your followers, but a lot of people are going to disagree with how to get there and if that's the right way to go, and it's going to be harder to get it there. So I think one of the most important things in our politicians, and I'll cut this short because I know I'm blabbering a lot, but I think one of the most important things in our politicians is having people who have a realistic understanding of how the world works, more so than having a grand vision or having a penchant for compromise. And one of the guys who was able to do a lot of that, one of the guys who had a really good vision for the country, was the guy who we're sitting in the temple of right now, President Richard Nixon. And nobody likes him. He has a lot of baggage on that kind of thing, but if you look at his record, he got a lot of stuff done, and he did it within the realm of his conscience. And I think that kind of pragmatic decision-making is lost on both the No Labels compromisers and the Ted Cruz, Bernie Sanders principled ideologues.
I want to point out the difference between compromising and selling out because that hasn't been addressed. I think that, yes, you could say that Hillary Clinton's really good at compromising, or you could say she's really good at lying and you don't know what she's supporting. For example, when she switched to supporting a $15 minimum wage in the middle of a debate because Bernie Sanders was gaining ground on her. When she was very adamant about imposing a tax on Wall Street as First Lady, but then joined the Senate and changed her mind coincidentally. There is a difference between compromising and understanding the other party's beliefs and selling out your beliefs to do whatever you think will get you into office and whatever you think will temporarily appease the American people. Now, someone who can actually compromise is the only candidate who's pledged to have a bipartisan cabinet, the only person who's pledged to have advisors on both the right and the left, which is something Hillary Clinton hasn't done. And quite frankly, I don't think that's very bipartisan or very indicative of compromise if she's only compromising with people who already agree with her.
Well, with compromise, I don't want to cut you out.
Okay, sure. So speaking of compromise and conversation, I'm reminded, and I know there was already a full forum on this topic, but I'm reminded of this thing that has guided conversation in America, especially on college campuses in the last year or 2 years, and that's political correctness. And to even have a conversation is a lot harder now, and this is a very odd sentiment to express to someone who doesn't live it every day, to someone who's maybe retired or has just been in their job for a long time and hasn't experienced the more social side of identity politics. It's really hard to say what you mean whilst sort of tiptoeing around the boundaries of what you're allowed to say without offending other people. And I know that's not what the question's about, and that's not what anyone really truly cares to focus on because it's a waste of our time. The basic principle of interpersonal dignity and respect is not one that's hard to understand. Almost everyone I know has at least heard that that's what you're supposed to do when you talk to people, is be respectful and be kind and honest. And because of some odd guidelines that a lot of young people have bought into, especially on college campuses, none of these conversations are easy to even have. It's hard to even have a conversation about having a conversation when people are kicking you. I'm kicked out of meetings and club organizations and events on campus all the time. And it's often because I'm affiliated publicly with a specific journal, but I'm just kicked out because they don't want my presence there. People don't want to have conversation. And this is an issue when people who are student leaders on campus start to buy into it, because then they make their clubs and their organizations closed to certain people who presumably have different opinions from those being discussed in the club, and it hinders all sorts of progress. And it's ironically, this notion of political correctness comes from the mouths of people preaching progress, but it specifically goes against helping them reach that goal. I don't want to focus on that. I know there was, like I said, a full panel on the topic in the spring, but it's worth keeping in mind how hard it is for an average, and I have no idea what average means in this case, but an average Trump supporter and an average Hillary supporter, especially millennials, to sit next to each other and just say who they're supporting, let alone why or any policy opinions. So.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Max.
Going back to polarization, political correctness is just huge in this. You have even people not formally shutting down for political correctness, but these feelings of, oh, it's not politically correct to say this, it's not politically correct to say that. You see it on the news media all the time, people just hammering people for having certain views, and it's not the right thing to do. I want to listen to people's views. I want to know why they have these views. I don't want to stifle by political correctness. I think it's awful.
Luke, go ahead, and then I'm gonna ask a question for you guys. Go ahead.
So I agree, political correctness is bad. It hurts. You know, I've been censored before. I've been prevented from speaking before because people thought that my views were intolerable in a civilized society. So that happens. But at the same time, there's a certain kind of respectability that you need to bring to the table too, to it. And I think a lot of the time, I mean, we on the right tend to be the targets of this, who the media focuses on the most. But frankly, if you look at what's happened in the Republican Party, my party, for the last 30 years, there's been a kind of political correctness of its own, in the sense that if people disagree with the prevailing conservative ideology, they get booted out of the party, they get talked down at events. It happens. It's not as egregious as what happens on college campuses these days, but in other ways, it might be more important. And you know, the fundamental thing I would argue is that when you put your principles above basic human decency, when you put your goals and visions above basic human decency, that's when you get tempted to go do things that you otherwise would not do. That's what the Jacobins did. That's what the Soviets did. And fundamentally, I think we have a tendency for us political thinkers to ideologize whatever it is we're thinking. Well, we need to get beyond ideology. We needed to get to the point where we can have a pluralistic point of view and accept other people if we're going to be accepted ourselves. And frankly, I don't like a lot of the political correctness that goes on campuses, but I don't feel sorry for everybody who gets attacked by it, because sometimes, and I've seen it happen at USC before, they call it upon themselves.
Well, with saying stuff that people don't like in mind, the national debt is $20 trillion by some estimates. Unfunded entitlements are over $100 trillion. You guys can blame that on me and some of these folks, but it's your problem now. So tell us how you're going to fix it. Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we had a generation that thought, once again, what can the country do for you? How can we help your life through entitlements? And it wasn't sustainable, unfortunately. I would love to make everyone's life perfect and everyone get equal playing field, but it's not realistic. We have a $20 trillion national debt. We need to realize that we cannot help everyone out, and we need to start accounting for this. Otherwise, we're going to go off a fiscal cliff, and everyone's going to be living in poverty, and not just some. So I think when you talk about entitlements, if the government promised someone something, they need to fulfill that promise. But in the future, we need to learn from our mistakes and not promise people things that are just unsustainable.
Miles, you're up.
All right. I'm going to agree with Max on this one in that there needs to be a cutoff line of where we need to say stop and to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future. One way that I believe this could be done through Social Security, for instance, an entitlement that started in the 60s that will unfortunately be running out within the next 2 decades or so. One of the things that I believe that can be done about this is simply just to say stop, and that would mean for our generation or people around my age, around 20, 19, 18, who have yet to start working or just starting to work, have them not pay into Social Security at the same time. So this would mean that they would have to start saving for their own futures and not rely on government policy and the government to fall back on them. At the same time, we have to finish the commitment that the government has started to those that have spent their entire lives paying into Social Security. It'd be unfortunate and downright humiliating and impossible to take away that money from them at this point after they've spent so much of their time and lives contributing to this.
Elliot, go ahead.
I share a handful of those views, but national debt is not why I'm voting for Trump, and I don't think it's why the average college graduate should be compelled to vote for him either.
David?
I think the national debt is an incredibly pressing issue. It's something we need to be incredibly wary of. And some of the ways we can fix it is by decreasing the size of government. Government has become bloated, it's become inefficient, and it's too large, costs too much money. Gary Johnson, for example, pledges to cut the federal government by 20%. Then we can look at things like Social Security, and going off of Miles' plan, we can, for people who have yet to pay into Social Security, create a program that's opt-out, whereby the government will take a portion of your check and store it at regular interest rates as if it were a treasury bond, and then you can get it back at any time because it's your money. If we do that, then we'll never have to worry about running out because the people who are paying in are getting the exact amount of money that they put into the system. While we also maintain the right for people to opt out of that system so they can do what they want with their money. We can maximize liberty. So for example, if you feel comfortable investing that money, you can invest money and get money back at a rate that is higher than the rate of inflation, earning yourself money in the process. We can also do things like increase taxes on just the top of the top 1%. I think we have an issue in America where we vilify lawyers and doctors for making $300,000 a year after going into $700,000 of debt. We have an issue where we look down upon CEOs for working hard. And there's nothing wrong with working hard. There's nothing wrong with making a large amount of money. But if you're making $3+ million per year, you can afford to pay a bit more taxes after the third millionth dollar. And if we do all of those combined, if we cut government, increase taxes on the most wealthy Americans, and revise the way we do Social Security, we can drastically put a dent in our national debt.
Luke, go ahead, and then Max, I'll give it to you.
Please raise your hand if you would like to make drastic cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and temporary aid to needy families. 7.
Well, you got some.
There's your voters, guys. So here's the thing. And I am a Republican, by the way. I'm a bad Republican. I'm an Eisenhower Republican. But I'm very much within the Republican tradition on this. The post-New Deal social contract is basically a question of who subsidizes whom. It's basically a question of which social classes and which industries are going to be winners. And frankly, that, I think, is how things work. Governments pick winners and losers not on the question of how well they compete, but based on the question, well, is this a social class we would like to see elevated in society and protected from the buffets of the global economy? So back in the 30s, when President Roosevelt and the New Deal Coalition put in the basics of the welfare state we have right now, they were doing it with an eye to building up a mass middle class that would still operate in a market system but would be buffered from the threats of the global market by basic income security, basic health care, education, these kinds of things. It's a social safety net thing. Can we restructure all these programs? Yes, and we should. And anybody who says we shouldn't is a hack trying to get your vote. But that said, should we revert to the pre-1930s, in fact, pre-1890s system whereby we relied on everybody's individual effort to get them through life in what is an increasingly complex society. I'm a conservative. I'm a social conservative, and I don't think that would be a humane thing to do. I think we need to rethink our social safety net. I think we need to rethink our social contract. But I don't think the way to do that is balancing the budget on the backs of the poor and making national debt a more important topic than the welfare of the American people. Now, there are ways to do it, and I'm open to talking about it, but I disagree with all of my fellow panelists here in the sense that I think transfer payments aren't going away. We just need to figure out how to spend it better in a more sustainable way, in ways that encourage productivity and independence and make for a better dream for all Americans.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, that's great and all, but when you say let's spend it better, I think politicians have been saying that for years. It's not going to happen. And when you say adding more tax to the very rich, you have people in California and New York paying 60% income tax. It's insane. It's not sustainable. You can't say they can afford to pay 60% income tax. They're never going to invest in small business. They're never going to hire more people to work in jobs. They're never going to be able to pay people more in their jobs. People are forever going to need Social Security, and they're never going to get it if we have high taxes and unsustainable social programs.
Is any candidate saying anything along the lines of what you guys want to hear on this particular issue? Yeah.
Frankly, they're not saying what I want to hear. They're not talking about reforming it, but they're not saying anything that particularly worries me on either of those issues.
Miles, go ahead.
When it comes to Hillary Clinton and her opinions on these policies, she's implemented, or she has an idea that she'd like to implement a tax cut or increase taxes for everyone making over $250,000. Now, listening to David, I do agree with him in that that's probably too low. It's in the vein of what I'd like to hear, and it's in the vein of what needs to happen in the country. At the same time, $250 would vilify and penalize way too many people, such as doctors and lawyers and other valued members of society that happen to earn a lot of money, but all of that money is hard-earned, and it comes from years of law and medical school. So that's one thing that I like, but I do believe that the number is too low. The other thing Hillary Clinton that I agree with is that she calls for the need to end Social Security and that the system is unsustainable and that it won't continue to work. At the same time, while I agree with that in theory, we need to eliminate some social programs, but also do so in the way that will harm the least amount of Americans. There is a way of going about it, and there is a way of going about in spending money that the government has more effectively. There is a way of effectively and efficiently spending more tax dollars that's not currently being used by current and past administrations. We need to take a careful and slow look at it and what we can do to best spend our money.
Got any ideas on which programs have to go?
I will agree with Hillary Clinton in that Social Security does need to be eliminated. However, it should be done in phases. The government should fulfill its promises to American people. I believe that's one that should be phased out eventually, yes.
Luke, go ahead.
This is a historical backdrop, so let's let them talk first, and then I'll say my thing.
Okay. Anybody have any ideas of what specifically, since you're going to be dealing with this debt problem, what do you take out? What goes away?
Well, in California, we have a pension problem. Basically, we took money out of people's paychecks. We said, you're going to get this much money because we predicted how much we thought that it would be worth in however many years. Well, guess what? The government was wrong about many other, just like in many other ways. And now we have to pay people an amount of money that their money is not worth anymore. That they took maybe $10,000 out of their paycheck, and they said, well, it's going to be worth $20,000 in a few years. So the government didn't invest it properly, and now it's not worth that much money. And now we had a issue in California because of this.
So what goes?
So
I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me what goes.
We have to take out Social Security. We have to take out retirement plans and turn them into not completely abolish them. It's sort of what I believe Luke was saying before about the idea of instead of fixed benefits, fixed contributions. So we're acknowledging that you contributed $10,000, and we're going to put it in a private account for you, not just put it in with the rest of the government money and invest it and say it's going to be worth this much money, but say this is $10,000. You can choose how you want to invest it. We have a few options, and it's going to be, and you can constantly check and see how much money it's worth. If it's losing money, you can take it out. If it's gaining money, you can leave it in. And that's a good way to balance Social Security in a sustainable way.
I think most of us up here do agree with the idea that Social Security does need to be cut. But I think one thing that would definitely improve and one thing that would definitely progress our society in general is if we all became more financially literate. The reason why Social Security was established is simply so that the people that weren't taking good care of their money could, in their old age after they retired, they'd be able to get some money back and make sure they didn't go into debt. If we don't need Social Security to do that, we don't need the government leaning down and taking care of every single thing that, honestly, if more people put in the effort to, wouldn't be necessary in the first place.
I'm not sure if that's historically accurate, but go ahead.
So I hope I don't seem like a heretic to y'all for opposing these kinds of cuts and stuff like that. But, you know, a mentor of mine, a guy by the name of Michael Lind, told me once that one way you could save a lot of money, and I'm all for being fiscally conservative when you can, I'm all for good bookkeeping. One of the ways you can save a lot of money is simplifying the systems that we have, simplifying the welfare systems, simplifying the entitlement systems, simplifying the education systems and healthcare systems, all of them. And so if you look at the numbers, there's something like 8, 9, 10, 11 different social welfare agencies that do different things for different communities. Burn it to the ground and build it from the top, or build it from the bottom up with a simple universal income supplement or something along those lines, a universal entitlement that is applicable to everybody, not tailored to people in different constituencies and different kinds of stuff. That's a way to save money and be fair to people all across the board at the same time. I don't hear any candidates talking about massively simplifying Social Security and massively simplifying these other programs, but I do think it's a way that as the Republican Party recovers from this election in about 4 years from now, that's something the policy wonks could be thinking about, how to recreate an agenda that will get working class support, lower class support, but will also be fiscally more responsible, and something that will simplify government, which is something everybody likes to do.
We're moving kind of quickly through time, and I want to skip ahead to a couple of points to make sure that everybody has some say on this one, because there was a brief discussion before we got started about this, about cybersecurity threats, and which candidate has a better sense of how to deal with that sort of thing. And of course, it's been in the news an awful lot recently. So, who wants to take that on?
I'd love to.
There you go.
So the president does not single-handedly fight cybersecurity threats from around the world. This is something that's done by agencies with black budgets and things that we don't want to hear about. There's crazy things going on in the world of cybersecurity theft. But what the president can single-handedly do is speak in a particular manner towards countries and to us about other countries that commit intellectual property theft mainly, and our cybersecurity threats generally. And when Donald Trump talks about being stricter on China, whether that comes in a million different forms in terms of practical strictness, that's an attitude that America needs to have going forward if we are serious about the success of Silicon Valley in the long term. If we want innovation to really thrive in America, we have to not outright stop, but we need to be wary that China and its intellectual property system is turning away from made in China and turning towards created in China because of a handful of corrupt policies that allow the state to proxy encourage different forms of intellectual property theft and steal important and valuable designs from American inventors.
His premise is just fundamentally false. This idea that the president just getting mad at China is going to stop all cybersecurity is ludicrous. I mean, firstly, I want to agree with him on the notion that the president really has very little say in cybersecurity, because none of these people are genius-level coders. They don't understand what they're doing. They're given advice, and they listen to that advice because they don't understand what's going on. Plus, I want to point out very clearly, the people in China that are trying to hack America know that they're breaking the law. If Trump says, don't break the law, it doesn't matter because it's not like they were unaware that this was happening, right? Like, do you think Putin wants us to be hacking him? No, but we're already doing it. We're already hacking the entire world is hacking us. This idea that Trump just getting mad at other countries is going to stop it is ludicrous because the country is already mad. If you were actively being hacked by another country, would you not be mad? You would be. China knows that. Russia knows that. Every country in the world knows that, and they're still doing it. So getting mad won't do a thing.
It's entirely not true. Trump talks to an audience of tens, hundreds of millions of people on a daily and obviously
China has
weekly
over a
basis.
billion.
Irrelevant.
You know, I never thought I'd agree with a libertarian friend of mine on anything, but I have to agree with David. Talk doesn't change foreign policy. Talk doesn't change foreign policy. Getting tough on China by talking mean to China and posing up a tariff wall won't change Chinese behavior. We saw President Bush have the Forward Strategy for Freedom, which was more or less a campaign, a soft power campaign, if that exists, to get crumbling Islamic societies that were going through a social crisis of their own to accept Western liberal democratic norms. And look what happened by 2008. We had, in 2009, President Obama came into the Oval Office with the idea of creating a reset with the world, the pivot to Asia, the reset with Russia, the tour through the Middle East where he talked to all these Middle Eastern groups and talked about not apologizing, but generally renewing relations. It was all talk. And I don't think the world became any safer because of it. No, there is definitely an element of talking in foreign policy, but you're probably an internationalist diplomat if you think that talking is all of foreign policy. And you know somebody who we can look back to about how we can restore a more realistic, pragmatic, hard power tradition that keeps the talk on the sides nice. President Nixon was one of the guys who knew how to do that. Well, tour the library after this, everyone.
Just a quick response to what David was saying. Knowing that you're breaking the law does not make it okay, and that sounds like a cop-out argument I hear on immigration all the time.
Miles, go ahead.
When it comes to issues of cybersecurity, and when another country inflicts an attack on the U.S. cyberspace, politicians tend to use the word cyber warfare, as in an attack has been committed on our country. An attack has been committed on U.S. intellectual property. Some people believe this should be taken as a declaration of war. I don't. I don't believe it should go that far. Infiltrating, information through the internet should be claimed as an actual attack, costing American lives potentially. But one thing I do think is important is that somebody, and I know obviously that the president isn't a single issue person. They don't know everything. They have a number of advisors advising them on things. But I do trust someone that has taken the time, that has worked in foreign service, that has gone all over the world, and knows other countries and knows how to respond to when things get ugly. It knows how to respond strongly with a strong foreign policy, but also carefully and cautiously, and isn't going to react in a really reactionary way to something that maybe takes a lot more time and a lot more thinking before an action is completed.
I also I agree with a lot of what he said. I mean, we can't really go to war over against these people for committing intellectual theft, but I'd like a country that at least would install a little bit of fear in these countries that think they can get away with whatever they want to do and they can steal from us and it's okay. Because it's not okay, but should we go to war is another question. I think when you look at the candidates, you see Hillary Clinton says, basically, I'll never put ground troops in Syria, I won't go to war in other places. She's very pacifist. You see Donald Trump, he's also, he's criticized the war in Iraq. He's not some sort of crazy warmonger, but he's also a guy that's openly said, leave the possibility open. Make sure these countries know that we're not completely objected to going to war and to using our armed forces.
David, I think you're about to say something, but to you, this does affect real lives just because intellectual property theft through hacking isn't something you can see unless you really know how to read code. It affects real people when they don't get credit or they don't get paid for their inventions in the U.S. or people who would go on to run massive tech companies in the U.S. just don't exist because the patents exist in other places or people can just pick up technologies that have been patented with no real work put in other countries.
I absolutely agree. I mean to clarify in that I believe that Hillary Clinton means to have the strongest response in that, but also a cautious response. One that requires thinking, one that requires caution and advice taken from advisors, but also a person, and also someone that's supposed to represent our nation that says no to these kind of attacks with a very strong response. That would include that if we get hit by a cyber attack, perhaps we're launching one back. Not to instigate crisis, but to also make sure and to give countries around the world and anyone that would dare oppose us in cyberspace that we mean business in this realm.
Max and Elliot are wrong, and I want to be very clear about why they're wrong. So firstly, this idea that Trump is not a war hawk because he doesn't support the war in Iraq is incorrect. He supported the war in Iraq when people were voting for the war in Iraq. Unfortunately, he has no government history to be held to, so we can't look at his voting records because he has no voting records to look at because he's unqualified. Now, if we're looking at the statements he gave when people were voting on the war in Iraq, we know that he was pro that war. Secondly, we know he's actually not anti-international hacking because he literally asked Russia to hack us. I want to say that again. He literally asked Russia to hack us, and you're saying he's anti-international hacking. Then, if it was easy to track down international hackers, don't you think we would have done it already? Don't you think we wouldn't have groups in America like Anonymous, like Poodle Corporation, hacking our government, hacking our senators? The issue is that they're hard to track down, and the government is trying. But guess what? All the people we've caught, you don't know about them because they're already in prison and they haven't hacked anyone.
Luke, I'm going to give you the last word because I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience.
Let us be clear, folks, and not mince words. We are at war. We are in what the Pentagon calls operations other than war in various theaters, including cyberspace. But these aren't just bandit raids. These aren't just little maneuvers like that. These are things that countries in tense international competition do with each other in physical space. You're seeing it in the Gulf of Aden, in Syria, in Crimea and the Ukraine, and possibly soon in the Baltics. You're seeing it in the East and South China Seas. You're seeing it all over the world. It's not a shooting war. It's a graduated response, as they called it in the mid-Cold War. And it's happening in cyberspace too, as we mentioned. I'm no expert in cyberspace, and I don't claim to be, but the sheer amount of attacks that happen every day, every week by operators who we can't track down, and we don't know who they are, but we can guess with extreme probability who's directing them: Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollahs. We can guess with pretty clear acknowledgement that these folks do not have our best interests at heart, and if we keep a trigger finger like Donald Trump's too hard on the trigger, then something might break out. Now, I'm not saying back down and let them have it. I'm not saying back down and avoid war at all costs. But I am saying we need to seriously rethink our policies in order to adapt to this reality where operations other than war are not an aberration but the norm, and that means something other than President Obama's weak-kneed multilateralism and something other than George W. Bush's trigger-happy kind of response. And I frankly don't think either of the candidates are proposing that sort of thing. I don't think any of the third-party candidates are proposing that sort of thing either. I'm riding in Colin Powell. He's not going to win. My conscience is clean, and we will see what happens in 2020.
All right, we have, I saved about 10, 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So I think somebody's got a live mic.
Thank you, Nick, and our distinguished panel. I'd like to start out just by asking, we didn't hear much about immigration policy. Which candidate is better on immigration policy for the millennials' future? Why don't we start with David?
So quite honestly, Gary Johnson and Hillary Clinton have rather similar plans. It's important to have a border that is semi-permeable, a border that allows people into the country legally, and one that cuts down on illegal immigration. That being said, the idea that we're going to deport 11 million illegal immigrants is just false. It's not going to happen. And the reason why it's not going to happen and the reason why Trump is lying to you is because illegal immigrants are good for our economy, because they are statistically less likely to commit a crime than US citizens, by a large margin. And this is because The people who are willing to face death, who are willing to face imprisonment to come to this country, are not the same people who want to ruin that by getting locked up. They're the type of people who just want to give their kids a good life. And I'm not condoning what they do. I'm not saying that we should have more illegal immigrants, but I am saying they are not taking American jobs. They are working for far less than minimum wage in conditions far worse than Americans will take. They are taking jobs that Americans will not take. They are providing for our economy, and they won't be deported. And Trump is lying to you if he says they will be deported, because it would collapse our economy. It would be awful for our economy. No one would replace those jobs. We wouldn't know what to do.
Max?
And that's my stance on immigration.
I have a
To
slightly
see
different.
Max something was going on there.
Okay, I have a slightly different stance on immigration. First of all, immigration's good. We need to expand our economy, and that comes through growth in population. But we also need a border. And I think that you either have a border or you don't. If you let people come across the state lines and don't enforce the law, then that's effectively an open border. We need to have a fence go up in areas where people are coming through, and we need to stop illegal immigration. This idea that illegal immigrants are great for our economy is just counterintuitive, because they're working for jobs less than Americans work for, and they're undercutting our minimum wage, our laborers. Our laborers are losing jobs because of that. Now, I don't think that these illegal immigrants are bad people. I don't think that I think that they're great. They're great hard workers because they do these things. And I think that we should make these people citizens if they show they've put in hard work. But the whole idea that we should just say, all right, they're all citizens now because they came across our border and they broke our law is absolutely ridiculous.
I would like to address that. First, you're making a straw man, because neither Clinton nor Gary Johnson said you should just make all illegal immigrants American citizens. So that's just incorrect. Secondly, we have net negative Mexican immigration. We are losing Mexican immigrants. So the idea that Mexicans are rushing our border is incorrect. Secondly, I was in Mexico last week. We have a border. It's there. We already have a fence that just goes across all the parts of the border that we can have a fence on. So this idea that just replacing this this fence with this magic 55-foot tall golden wall with this massive door in the middle is going to fix immigration is false. And finally, the majority of our illegal immigration is coming from people by plane. So unless you want to build a sphere around America, the wall's not going to work.
Luke, go ahead, and then we're going to have another question.
So, frankly, I don't doubt any of David's statistics. I don't doubt any of David's facts. But the fact of the matter is, and I think everybody knows I'm not voting for Donald Trump. Everybody knows I don't particularly support Donald Trump. But I think Donald Trump gets his instincts right on immigration. I think he gets the policies dead wrong. Build a wall? No. Deport 11 million people with families? No. But that said, is one of the biggest problems in American economics now that we are having wage depression, not labor competition, but wage depression, because we are importing millions of unskilled workers, not because of cultural reasons, but because the big industrialists and big financialists on Wall Street think it would be good to have more labor. I think that's reasonably true, and I think it would be better for the American labor market for it to be tighter, for there to be less labor flowing across international capital and international borders. But frankly, to all the free marketers out there who support a strong border but totally deregulated markets, the strongest border is strong unions, because they will vote for keeping the labor market tight. You can have a border that isn't enforced, and the labor unions will make sure politically that we keep it out. Now, we don't have strong unions here anymore. That, I think, is a problem for our political economy, but that's another discussion to get into. So, Trump, kind of right, not really right, but a step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Got a question here.
Question in the front row.
Oh, you gonna hold it, Jonathan? Okay. So, Miles, you make the comment that you want to make smaller government, right? Is that what you said?
Yes, in some factions.
Okay. And you don't want the government into our lives, is that correct?
I
You don't like
believe-
him invading our lives and telling us what to do and this and that and this and that, right?
It depends on the specific issue.
Okay. Well, according to Mr. Obama, President Obama, there's Julia, you know? You remember Julia? from the government to take care of you from baby to death, cradle to death. And Hillary is going to keep that momentum going. She is going to expand the government, make it more and make more money and all that. So she's not really for small government, is she? Or is she going to continue the big plan that Obama has?
In listening to Secretary Clinton's comments in the last debate and some of the things that the platforms that her campaign has put out, in some ways I agree that she is interested, I would not say in growing government, but in maintaining it at the same level that we've seen in the current Obama administration. But in some ways, she has come out in favor of shrinking it. She has come out in favor of getting rid of Social Security. She has come out in favor of, and like I said, it depends on the issue in my opinions, but also in Secretary Clinton's. When it comes to medical care, she's in favor of a single payer system, which means changing up the way it currently is, just saying how it is. Like I said, it depends on the issue. She said debt-free college, not free college for everyone. Private. I go to a private school. There is no way that they're going to that the government will ever make private institutions college or free or debt-free or anything like that. She would like to make in-state college, so like for students going to, let's say, UC Santa Barbara or public colleges, in-state, debt-free, and for those, I believe she said, earning under $125,000 a year. So under specific circumstances, she would like colleges to be debt-free. Personally, I don't believe that college at any point should be completely free unless you have like amazing scholarships that you've received, but those aren't from the government always. Those are from private institutions. If you're getting your scholarships and you're college free that way, kudos to you, you've worked hard and you deserve that. At the same time, like I said, it depends on the issue. In some ways, she's for maintaining the current size of government. In other ways, she's for shrinking the size of government.
Luke, go ahead.
Ma'am, I'd first like to commend you for your sweater. It's a very nice and patriotic sweater. I just want to point out that there's a difference between regulatory big government in HUD and in the education department and in the EPA that goes and controls people's lives and makes rules about what you can and can't do. And frankly, Franklin Roosevelt-style New Deal big government that goes and sets up economic conditions that make for a stabler political economy, introduce programs like Social Security, introduce programs like the Iron Triangle of business, labor, and government. Things that do not particularly interfere with people's lives, but give people the security and stability to live a life of liberty that they would like to do. I think the kind of big government that Hillary Clinton would propose is, yes, what you say. But I don't think that big government in itself is a problem, and I do think that it is very much a part of the American tradition from the founding all the way up till now and will be with us for the rest of our future as a nation.
We had another question.
We have a question right here.
Yes, I had a question that actually addresses not the conditions that we're dealing with right now, but being forward-thinking. If you were to think 20 years out, when you guys are fully invested in the payoff of your education for what you made the investment going to college, how do you guys account for the candidacies that are out there right now, being forward-thinking, dealing with these emerging trends such as artificial intelligence, automation, outsourcing, globalization, and the virtualization of things such as education and other things that could be distributed throughout the world at a far lesser cost to people who have a lesser cost of living. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I love to talk about free trade because free trade is something that's been just dismissed essentially by both candidates, at least that's what everyone thinks. But when you look at this, you see Hillary Clinton has talked about imposing an exit tax. That's on her website, on businesses. Donald Trump, he's talked about it. He's not actually stuck to that position. He actually wants to eliminate tariffs on Mexico and China. He was threatening them with that we would match their tariffs, but he wants to eliminate their tariffs. You can check his website. You can look at what he said. He does not like tariffs. And free trade is good because if another country can produce something for cheaper, then by all means that helps American consumers. I don't think that it's our duty to purchase from American businesses if those American businesses can't make the same product for cheap enough. We have to provide for our families. We have to eat, and and to do this, we have to buy the cheapest possible thing.
If we're going to buy the cheapest possible things, though, a lot of that would mean buying from countries that are going to produce those goods cheaper. China, Vietnam, Taiwan are great sources of that. They're going to they already have been producing a lot of our clothes for a very cheap price. Now, Donald Trump also wants to bring back a lot of jobs to American people. Those would likely include manufacturing jobs in the textile industry, in the automotive industry, bring back jobs that used to be in this country back into this country. If we're going to be for free trade and eliminating those tariffs, I find it very difficult for Donald Trump to bring back those jobs because most Americans, myself included, are going to want to buy the cheapest possible product, especially for students, I find.
I don't think.
Hold on a second. I'm not sure they answered your question. I didn't think so either. Go ahead, take a shot at it.
So, as a aspiring foreign policy planner, as a big admirer of statesmen in foreign policy like Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft, I agree completely with the need to look at the long-term trends for the future on how the global environment is going to be shaping and what the business environment looks like, what the power environment looks like, all that. That said, the trends that you mentioned are specifically artificial intelligence and automation. Okay, so I think there's so much we can do in those. We can look at what that's going to mean for the structures of other manufacturing economies, like the economies of East Asia. We can look at what that's going to mean for our economy and make assumptions on what the international trade environment will look like 20 years from now based on that. And we should be getting working groups in Washington to go be studying this kind of stuff. We should be commissioning think tank scholars to look at it and do all this kind of stuff. But I would not put it as the fundamental priority. I think the fundamental priority of government is still maintaining world order rather than maintaining world prosperity. And before I look at getting into how are we going to restructure the global economy, I would look into how are we going to make sure that the balance of power in Eurasia is something amenable to our interests that isn't about to break into an all-out war that would change the equation entirely. Do we have to think about things in the long-term future? Yes. But I'm not sure we're even capable of predicting what 30 years from now the political economy of South Korea is going to look like. We should try. We can and should try. But I don't think we're going to be as successful at that as we should be trying to be successful in just maintaining a good balance of power and a good portion of American power moving forward into the 21st century.
David, you look like you had something.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I want to make sure I answer your question. It was twofold. The first was on technological advances, particularly automation, and the second part was on the increase of international trade. Is that right? No. No. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned virtualization. Mm-hmm. So that outsourcing and redistribution towards that being able to happen remotely in places like Africa that are being developed right now. Mm-hmm. And there's large influx of capital going there. So when these jobs spread out, so like you're no longer having to go to a physical university, and you're able to look at virtualization and automation with things such as knowledge workers. How do you guys plan on being able to put yourselves in a competitive position in that environment that will be here in 10 years?
Okay, so I am a neuroscience major focusing in biotechnology. I am hoping that I am picking a major that is allowing me to pick a field that is not oversaturated. That's something I take in very much into account. I am hoping that my field is requiring of creative analysis because that's something that can't be automated. And I also am hoping that I am getting an education which puts me in a position where I am able to compete with the leaders in the industry. Is that? Okay, awesome.
A question in the second row.
My question is, what will your candidate do to create energy independence in America and to combat climate change? Will your candidate create jobs in sustainable energy?
Go ahead, Luke.
Well, Colin Powell isn't running for president, so he's not going to do any of that. But I would like to point out that there is a great model for this from a former president, President Richard Nixon. Surprise! President Nixon, as I wrote in a piece for the Nixon Foundation just recently, had a big plan for nuclear energy, a big plan as the 1973 Arab oil embargo was going on, and we were realizing we were dependent on foreign oil, to nuclearize the U.S. energy economy and build a fleet of something like 1,000 nuclear plants by the year 1990. It's clean, contrary to popular myth. It's reasonably safe. You only have, like, what, once in a decade problems that don't even kill anybody. And compare that to oil, compare that to natural gas, and it makes energy cheaper. It's expensive as an upfront investment, but it's over the long term, when you look at states that do it well, the energy works. So I am not opposed to solar, and Nixon was not opposed to solar. Nixon advocated extra research into solar. But the fact of the matter is, in 1973 and in 2016, solar energy has not proven itself capable to withstand the pressures of the market and provide cheap energy to the mass middle class of Americans. Nuclear energy did. Nuclear energy is doing that to the extent that it still exists, and nuclear energy can if we revive the ghost of Nixon and use that to build a nuclear energy fleet for the American people.
I'll add on to that. So Hillary Clinton as a candidate has come out in favor of making a lot more jobs accessible, but also injecting money into the economy so that, or investing in specific companies rather, so that there is more, there are more jobs that can be created within the green energy industry. At the same time, I do believe we need to be cautious and look carefully at which investments we make. I know recently, or not so much recently, but the Obama administration did invest in a solar panel company to produce cheap solar panels. What we didn't count on with that is China dumping a lot of incredibly cheaply made solar panels into the United States. And that really ruined the investment for that company, which was billions and billions of dollars. So I do agree that we do need to be, and Hillary Clinton is very much for reasonable investment into green energy sources. At the same time, we need to be cautious, we need to be careful, we need to look at what the market says, we need to look at which ones are going to be most viable in which areas, and we need to look at ways in which fossil fuel industries are currently being used throughout the country. We need to take a closer look at fracking and see if that's possible in some places or if it's a practice which should not be used in the United States.
We have a question right here.
Another question next.
Thank you. It's good to see all of you here this evening, and got a lot of bright, give us a little bit of hope for our future. A couple of questions, one regarding immigration and Social Security. I work in the mortgage industry. I was there when it busted in '07. In fact, I turned out the lights as we went out. Got a job a little later as all the mortgages directed into loan modifications. And looking at the applications nationwide, there are hundreds of thousands of people as of 4 years ago that still were not on their feet. They lost their shirt, their 401ks, everything. Social Security needs to be revamped, but not done away with, not anytime soon. Because a lot of these people are going to retire, and that's all they're going to have. Now, the next thing is, Social Security wouldn't be running out if the government, especially like brought out, but kept real quiet as 20 years ago, kept tapping into the Social Security to supposedly balance their budget. And that's been kept very, very quiet. Okay? So are you looking to do away with Social Security in the future across the board? Another question is on immigration is this. People come over illegally, and they have a vision, they have a dream. But there's a broad-based reason still that's behind that. A lot of guys come to work, and they take their money and send home. They have no vision of ever becoming a citizen. Okay? The other one, and it's more of a statement, I apologize for the question, but how would you deal with this? Because with immigration here, you say, well, it's good for the economy. To what degree? Because employers hire these guys that are going to look like dogs and get the job done. They have no benefits. They get hurt. What happens to them?
Well, thank you for your comments and statements, sir. It's very interesting and it is very, very helpful to see. I would say we have to be humane about it. We have to be uniting about it in our vision for Social Security and in our vision for immigration. We need to bring back the melting pot. We need to bring back the idea of a united American identity, but we also need to bring back the idea of enforcement for our laws and putting the interests of the American worker first. And I don't think Donald Trump has articulated the humane side of that. I think he has articulated the strategic side of that. But I think if we're going to have a leader who can inspire people to follow a sense and a vision of this sort of economic nationalism that you suggested, it's going to have to be with a nice face, not with the tirades that Donald Trump so often tends to bring out with it.
Well, in regards to immigration, I think that when you have a minimum wage, which I personally am against because of that exact reason, that if people want to work hard for lower than the minimum wage, I think they're entitled to, and I think that they can actually do quite get into the workforce very well that way. And when you have a minimum wage and you have people working under the minimum wage who are undocumented, it's going to undercut the worker. So we should absolutely try to reduce illegal immigration. So that means legalizing some and deporting. I mean, I wouldn't like to deport anyone who's working hard, only if they're a criminal. And I think that that's a compromise. I think that's a solid immigration plan to focus on people who are working hard, keep them in the country, give them legal status, and they'll have to go for the minimum wage, and we'll understand that, wait, maybe the minimum wage isn't the best idea if it's at $15 and people want to work for 10. I think it's a very solid stance.
Sir?
We have a question in the.
Just a quick answer to one part that you asked. Trump has proposed taxing remittances.
We had a question over here.
In regards to foreign policy and specifically U.S.-Russian relations, how do you think the United States should act both as a unilateral force, but also within multilateral organizations such as NATO, to try and not have such an antagonistic relationship with Putin and the rest of Russia?
Well, most recently, I think the thing that Putin has espoused is this, that Russia does not want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. And given the recent incidents with the Crimean Peninsula, we can see why. That being said, I think that the best way to ensure peace, but also to remain strong in American foreign policy, is simply to continue NATO. That's something that has provided a great deal of benefits. It's a great outlet, I have to say, for foreign policy. And it's a way of us acting out our American foreign policy without necessarily attaching the United States to it. I think it's very strategic in that matter that the United States can continue its aims and succeed in its aims in foreign policy abroad, but not necessarily with the U.S. flag behind it. I think that's a very good strategic benefit that we have.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in regards to Russia, we have a very big issue, and we talk about like no-fly zones in Syria, and like the red line in the sand. That's not something that can be enforced unless you are willing to shoot down planes and cross it. Hillary Clinton was asked this question in the debate, would she shoot down the planes, and she avoided it, because if you're going to impose a no-fly zone, if you're going to say, Russia, you cannot do this, you need to stop acting like an empire in an imperialistic way. You actually have to impose military force or sanctions, and then that would result in imports we get from Russia costing more, or that would result in the imports we get from Russia being changed. We'd have to buy from America now, and that would cost more. So either way, we're looking at a problem. We don't want to engage Russia militarily, and we also don't want to impose sanctions on them because that would hurt our economy.
Luke, go ahead, and then we're going to have a question.
We should not fear war with the Russians. We should not avoid war with the Russians as our only goal in foreign policy. We should not seek war. We should do our best to avoid war. But as Teddy Roosevelt once said, given a choice between righteousness and peace, we must choose righteousness. We must uphold what is left of the international order And if that means making a red line that we need to enforce, then so be it. If that means backing up our allies in the eastern side of Europe and in Central Asia, so be it. But, we must also be aware that America is not, never has been, and cannot in the future be a universal power capable of projecting its influence and running the world in all corners of the earth. We need stakeholders in all parts of Eurasia and in all parts of the other continents for that matter. And we need to have a respectful relationship with Russia based on strength in both of our countries to avoid the chances of war, but to not shrink from the challenge that the Russian resurgence is providing to us in this part of the century. It's complicated. You need good people up there in the State Department and in the Pentagon to do it, but it's not going to be expressed in one policy statement. It's going to be a game of chess that our next president has to deal with, and I just hope the best for the impending President Clinton, that she picks the right advisors, Robert Gates and Condoleezza Rice.
We have time for one more question. A gentleman in the first row.
How do you plan to repay the national debt? Because stopping the national debt is only the first step. How do you plan to repay the national debt?
You may be the one that's going to have to answer that, I'm afraid. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's something called the Laffer curve, and basically it states that when you tax people so much that they cannot afford to invest, they can't afford to maintain their businesses, that they're going to produce less tax revenue because they'll get poorer. And when you have lower taxes, you actually make more government revenue. Those people will have more to spend on sales tax and local tax. They'll give more to the government that way, and that will help to give the economy more money, to generate more revenue. And when you deregulate businesses and when you give them, basically the goal is to give people all the opportunity to invest, give people all the opportunity to have money, and then once everyone has money, once everyone gets into the top 1%, we make it like the top 5%, then all those people are paying an incredible amount of tax, because tax isn't generated by charging 60% income tax to the richest people. The best way to get income tax is to have a large group of rich people who pay a reasonable amount of tax.
Luke and then David.
So the Laffer curve is spelled L-A-F-F-E-R, but frankly it should be spelled L-A-U-G-H-E-R curve. I don't think it works. I have yet to see the evidence that it works, and frankly we can't cut our way and de-tax our way out of the debt and out of the recession. We need to grow our way out of this recession, and that will involve making a lot of painful investments, of spending a lot of money on growth, on rekindling American industry, rekindling American energy, doing this kind of stuff that we've done in the great nation-building epics of American history, building our way back to a strong economy that is not based on finance, but is based on the American nation's capacity to build stuff, and taxing our way from that into getting something like a stable budget. I don't see any other way. You can do the math, try it. It's going to take a century or more. But the big thing is we need to be reinvesting in growth, and we're not going to do that by cutting taxes that are going to stay overseas or in Grenada or wherever it is they're keeping their tax money these days. And we need to keep the American nation and not the free market at the core of our economic policy.
Well,
David, go ahead.
I'd also like to talk a bit about the Laffer curve, because he's, with all due respect, Max is misinterpreting the Laffer curve. So the Laffer curve essentially says that if you have income tax at 100%, you're not going to make any tax money because no one's going to work because you're taking all their money, so they have no incentive to work. What the Laffer curve doesn't say is that we shouldn't tax people. That's not at all what it says. What it says is that we should keep in mind that with every dollar of taxes you take from someone, you slowly decrease their incentive to work. However, if, for example, you're charging people 60% above $2 million a year, they're not going to suddenly stop working because they're still making millions of dollars, right? So it's unfortunately just a misinterpretation of the Laffer curve. Secondly, it's not just as easy as waving a magic wand and turning the top 1% into a top 5%. If we could just quintuple the amount of rich people in the country, we would just do it. It's hard. And that's why we need to take pragmatic steps towards this economy. And we also need to realize that trickle-down economics doesn't work. It's been tried, and it's why we have the largest wealth disparity in modern American history, because listening to the Laffer curve doesn't work. It's a modern theory that's been proven wrong. Now, on the actual national debt, which is your question, the way we repay the national debt is the same way that we halt its increase, which is slowly and incrementally. So the ways we do this is we cut down government spending, particularly on things like military. Our military spending is incredibly large, and we're paying for programs that we quite frankly don't use. Like, for example, we still have tank factories that produce tanks that we don't use to go to war. Next, we have to adjust the way that we do Social Security, modify the way that we do public education, because we've already seen that private companies are able to do public high school at a similar or higher quality for about half the price. And finally, we need to do welfare reform and relook at the way that we give money to America's poorest citizens. And as Luke says, we can do this by just making the program simpler. So one program I'm a big fan of is the negative income tax, whereby the poorer you are, the more money you make from the government up to a certain point. It makes sure that you're always incentivized to earn more money, but it also makes sure that the less money you're able to bring in, the more money the government will provide. And it makes the welfare system far simpler by simplifying everything down into one number. And by doing all of those steps, and by making sure that we have a viable tax plan that appropriately taxes America's wealthiest citizens, we are going to be able to slowly pay back the national debt.
That was fun. I want to thank everyone, thank our great panelists, our wonderful moderator. And a big thank you to the Nixon Foundation, especially Jonathan, for putting up with my father and myself for another great Collegiate Forum event.
Now, why didn't our presidential candidates come up and have such a reasoned and well-thought discussion on topics of substance? I'd like to thank you all. You did a great job. Nick, I'd like to thank you. Great job on moderating it. Wonderful. After the Constitutional Convention, someone came up to Benjamin Franklin and asked, what kind of government do we have? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And I think these gentlemen prove that I think we can keep the republic. And instead of America becoming a great empire that falls, we become exceptional, and we transcend that, and we keep our republic. Thank you all. Jonathan, if I can ask you to close.
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Thank you to our distinguished panel. Thank you, Robert and Megan. Please give everyone a round of applause. Again, copies of Vigilance, The Price of Liberty, are available for purchase in the museum store, and Robert and Megan will be happy to sign it for you if you'd like. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Great job.